A British officer did not enter the Confederacy through Richmond or Charleston or Lee's army. He entered through cotton smugglers, Mexican ports, and a corpse hanging near the road. In the spring of 1863, Lieutenant-Colonel Arthur James Lyon Fremantle left England with a soldier's curiosity and a gentleman's confidence that the world, if approached properly, would open itself to him. He was an officer of the Coldstream Guards, a man of position and discipline, and like many Englishmen watching the American War from across the Atlantic, he had begun with a vague sympathy for the North. Slavery offended him, as he said plainly enough, but the longer the war went on, the more his feelings shifted. The South, beleaguered and outnumbered, had acquired in British imagination the dangerous charm of the underdog. He wanted, as men of his class often wanted, to see for himself. Not merely to read dispatches filtered through northern papers, not to accept official rumour, not to listen to London club opinion hardening into certainty over brandy and smoke. He wanted the thing itself, the South behind the blockade. That phrase matters, behind the blockade. Because by April of 1863, the Confederacy was not simply a country at war, it was a country being squeezed. The Union Navy was trying to close its ports, cut off its markets, starve its armies of equipment, and make cotton, the one great economic weapon the South believed it possessed, harder and harder to move into the world. So Fremantle did not go to the front first. He went to the seam in the system. On the 1st of April, he anchored 3 miles from the mouth of the Rio Grande. Around him were roughly 70 merchant vessels waiting offshore. That single image tells you more about the Confederacy than a dozen speeches. 70 vessels, not in Charleston Harbor, not in New Orleans, not under some clean national flag of open commerce, but waiting outside a shallow, dangerous bar at the mouth of a border river, where cotton could be brought out through Mexico and turned back into money, arms, supplies, and hope. Fremantle's first sight of the Confederate war economy was not a battlefield. It was cotton piled near a miserable wooden village on the Mexican bank of the Rio Grande. He wrote that Bagdad had sprung into existence since the war began, and that for an immense distance, endless bales of cotton could be seen. There was the war, stripped of romance. A new town of shanties, created by blockade pressure, feeding ships that could not safely come in, with cargo moving slowly through shallow water by small steamers drawing only 3 feet. The South was not merely fighting, it was improvising a way to keep breathing. The bar itself was a hazard. Fremantle noted that the water might be only 2 to 5 feet deep, that the surf and undercurrent made the crossing dangerous, and that sharks abounded. Boats were often capsized there. It was not the sort of place where an empire usually enters a nation. It was the sort of place where necessity enters. He landed at Bagdad on April 2nd, calling it a miserable village. But misery in wartime can be profitable. Cotton that cost 6 cents a pound in Galveston, he was told, was worth 36 at the border. That was not a market. That was a pressure valve. Every bale said the same thing. The blockade had not stopped the South from trading. It had forced the South to trade through stranger, rougher, more expensive channels. From Baghdad, Fremantle crossed the river into Texas. He had no pass and was brought before a group of Confederate officers seated around a fire, contemplating a tin of potatoes. It is an almost perfect first scene. No marble halls, no polished staff officers, no theatrical dignity. Just rough men in flannel shirts, ancient trousers, jackboots, black felt hats, and the Lone Star of Texas. They were dirty, he said, but civil. That too is a useful sentence. Dirty, but civil. It might stand for much of what he saw in the first days: roughness and ceremony, poverty and pride, hospitality and sudden violence, all living beside one another without much embarrassment. One captain boasted that they had given the enemy hell on the Mississippi, hell on the Sabine, and hell in various other places. That was the Confederate war voice in miniature, defiant, local, profane, and confident. But in the same conversation came something darker. The officers spoke of a man named Montgomery, one of the so-called renegados whom they had carried off from the Mexican side and left on the road to Brownsville. Fremantle caught the smiles and understood that the word left was doing more work than it ought to do. Half an hour later, he saw what it meant. 200 yards from the road, slightly buried, was the body. His head and arms were above ground. His arms were tied. A rope was still around his neck, dangling from a small mesquite tree. Dogs or wolves had scraped away the earth. There was no flesh on the bones. Fremantle wrote with the flat shock of a man who understood exactly what he had just crossed into. I obtained this, my first experience of lynch law, within 3 hours of landing in America. There is a reason this belongs at the beginning of the series. Fremantle had come to see the Confederacy as a political cause, perhaps even as a romantic one. Within 3 hours of landing, he saw its frontier reality: men carrying revolvers, cotton moving through a war economy, and a corpse left as a warning beside the road. This was not Richmond's constitutional argument. This was sovereignty at the edge, personal, violent, improvised, and only half under anyone's command. General B, who commanded at Brownsville, told Fremantle that the killing had been against his sanction and that he was sorry for it. Colonel Duff, whose men were involved, confessed that the affair was wrong, then added that his boys meant well. It is a chilling little phrase, and one of those accidental admissions history preserves because nobody involved seems to understand how damning it is. They meant well, meaning perhaps that they thought themselves defenders of order. Meaning that in a border country, surrounded by enemies, renegades, smugglers, spies, speculators, and men who changed allegiance as easily as they crossed the river, they believed their own violence had a kind of rough legitimacy. But a republic cannot live forever on men meaning well with ropes in their hands. This is why Fremantle is valuable. He is not an abolitionist pamphleteer inventing monsters for northern readers, and he is not a southern memoirist polishing the past after defeat. He admired the Confederates, he says so. He was drawn to their courage, their energy, their determination under enormous odds. But because he admired them, his record is more revealing, not less. He notices their virtues. He also notices what those virtues could excuse. The border gave him the whole Confederacy in miniature. There was cotton because the South still believed commerce could rescue it. There were foreign merchants because the war had internationalized everything. There were Confederate officers in poverty, ready to scour Brownsville for the materials to make cocktails in honor of British guests, because ceremony mattered even when boots did not. There were Mexican towns marked by revolution and foreign consulates suddenly made important by war. There was gaiety, gambling, fandangos, dinners, wine, dust, heat, and the strange hospitality of men who might drink with you all afternoon and speak lightly of killing by evening. On Good Friday, Fremantle walked into Matamoros and found the cathedral crowded with kneeling women. On Sunday, he dined with German merchants who had grown rich on cotton speculation. On Monday, a quartermaster broke open a box and gave him a Confederate felt hat to travel in. On Tuesday, he drank with officers who despised the Yankees, met an Englishman who claimed to have renounced his country until Britain did justice to the South, and was introduced to the very man supposed to have hanged Montgomery. It is all there, side by side, with no modern narrator needed to force the contrast. Piety and profit, poverty and courtesy, politics and private revenge, patriotism and smuggling, a border society at war, convinced of its own honor, dependent on practices that made honor difficult to distinguish from necessity. Fremantle did not yet know Gettysburg was waiting for him. He did not know that within 3 months he would stand near Lee's army at the great hinge of the war, but the South had already shown him its essential contradiction. It could be brave and generous, and it could be lawless. It could speak of national destiny while surviving through loopholes. It could charm a foreign officer at dinner and leave a man dead by the road. That was not hypocrisy exactly. It was a country under pressure revealing what pressure reveals. The mistake would be to treat this opening as an oddity, a colourful border prelude before the real story begins. It is the real story beginning. Nations at war show themselves most clearly at their edges. The capital tells you what a people wants to believe about itself. The border tells you what it must do to survive. Fremantle crossed that border in April 1863. Vicksburg was already tightening. Lee was preparing for the movement that would carry him north. Richmond still imagined endurance. The cotton merchants still imagined profit. The soldiers at Brownsville still imagined victory. And the British officer, newly arrived, still imagined he was entering a struggle whose meaning could be understood by courage, manners, and observation. He would learn more. For now, he had seen the first lesson. The Confederacy was not only an army. It was a world, improvised, proud, violent, hospitable, commercial, devout, and already under the kind of strain that makes every contradiction sharper. And he had entered it not through to the front door, but through the crack in the wall. This is Fremantle's 3 months in the South. Next, the Cotton Road into the Confederacy. Subscribe for the rest of the Fremantle series. In the next episode, we follow him into the Texas interior, where distance itself becomes one of the Confederacy's greatest weapons and one of its fatal weaknesses.